This is the man who died too quietly, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, your faithful companion on yet another expedition into the shadowed corners of human nature. Allow me to express our deepest gratitude to our devoted listeners across the globe. If this is your maiden voyage with us, do consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling us from which corner of the world you listen. Tonight, silence is the deadliest weapon of all. Lower your lights, pour yourself a calming tisane in the manner of Poirot himself, and ready those little grey cells of yours. Chapter 1. The House That Breathed. You will find it most restorative, mon ami, Dr. Leonard Caldwell had written, in the neat, confident hand of a man accustomed to prescribing things. The air is quite exceptional. The sea is always there. And the quiet, well, the quiet is absolute. Hercule Poirot had read this letter twice, tilted his egg-shaped head to one side, and decided that a fortnight in Cornwall was marginally preferable to a fortnight in bed in Whitehaven Mansions, which was where his physician had suggested he spend his convalescence. He did not, as a rule, care for the sea. The sea was disorderly. It refused to be arranged. But Dr. Caldwell's invitation had included a secondary purpose, a contribution to a medical paper on the psychology of recovery. And that, at least, had the virtue of sounding useful. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the light over the Cornish cliffs was the colour of old pewter, and the wind came off the water in long, cold sighs. St. Anselm's convalescent house stood back from the cliff edge behind a fringe of wind-bent hawthorns. It had been a Georgian manor once, and it retained the bones of that former grandeur, the wide sash windows, the dressed stone portico, the symmetry that Poirot found immediately agreeable. What had been added since, however, gave him pause. The ramp alongside the front steps, the discreet brass plate beside the door, the faint smell caught even before he crossed the threshold of antiseptic and lavender polish, braided together into something that was almost, but not quite, pleasant. A young housemaid took his 2 suitcases. Poirot watched to ensure they were carried with appropriate care. Dr. Caldwell was waiting in the entrance hall, beneath the gaze of a row of long-dead naval officers in gilt frames. He was a tall man in his late 50s with a scholar's stoop and a physician's eyes, watchful, perpetually assessing. His handshake was warm. "My dear Poirot, you look remarkably well for a man who has been ill." "I am always remarkably well," Poirot replied with perfect sincerity. "It is only my doctor who disagrees." Caldwell laughed and led him through the corridor toward his room. The floors were old timber, and they creaked with what Poirot could only describe as the slow dignity of a house that had witnessed a great deal and had chosen, on reflection, to keep most of it to itself. His room was satisfactory. The bed was firm. The window looked out over a garden that descended in neat terraces to a low stone wall, beyond which the sea moved in long grey swells. Poirot approved of the terraces. He did not approve of what lay beyond them. He washed, changed his collar, and descended for dinner at 7:30 precisely. The dining room was long and panelled, with a table set for 7. Poirot was introduced to his fellow residents in the brief, democratic way that English convalescent houses seem to favour, as though the illness that brought each person here were a sufficient bond and further explanations superfluous. There was Arthur Fenwick, who rose to shake Poirot's hand with the measured, unhurried authority of a man who had long since ceased to need to impress anyone. He was perhaps 70, broad across the shoulders, with a heavy jaw and pale blue eyes that took in Poirot and filed him, evidently, under a heading of mild interest. He was, Caldwell had mentioned, a steel magnate, though he looked rather like steel himself, dense, dark, and not easily bent. Beside him sat his wife, Margaret Fenwick, who was a great deal younger and a great deal more carefully composed. Her evening dress was expensive without being showy. Her posture was exact. But there was something in the way she held her wineglass. The faint rigidity of the fingers that suggested composure achieved through practice rather than nature. To Poirot's left was Clara Ashcroft, who was introduced as a painter. She had the angular face and the direct gaze of a woman accustomed to looking at things rather than being looked at. She was perhaps 50 and wore her grey streaked hair pinned up with magnificent indifference. When she was introduced to Poirot, she studied him for a moment with the frank attention of a portraitist, measuring a subject. "Belgian?" she said. "Oui, madame." "Interesting bone structure," she said, and returned to her soup. Poirot was not certain whether to be flattered. Edward Mallory was the last to appear, sliding into his seat with the apologetic manner of a man who has spent years making himself unobtrusive. He was slight, pale and quietly dressed, with the look of someone who had once been more robust and had not yet quite accounted for the change. He was a solicitor, it emerged, or had been. He offered no further clarification, and no one asked for any. Nurse Alice Green moved between the kitchen and the table with the efficient silence of a woman who has reduced her occupation to its purest form. She was 40, perhaps, with dark hair drawn back from a face that was handsome in an undemonstrative way. She had requested this particular post. McCaldwell had mentioned in passing. Poirot noted this. The dinner was good, if plain. Conversation moved along the usual channels: the weather, the inadequacies of the railway, the relative merits of this stretch of Cornish coastline. Poirot listened with great attention and contributed little. It was toward the end of the main course that Arthur Fenwick spoke, not to anyone in particular, but in the manner of a man who expects to be heard, regardless. "Some mistakes cannot be undone," he said in the same tone one might use to observe that the roast was slightly overdone. "No matter how much money one spends." The effect was immediate, though no one moved. Dr. Caldwell's fork paused in mid-air for a beat too long before he set it down and reached for his glass. Clara Ashcroft lowered her eyes to her plate with the careful precision of someone choosing not to react. And Margaret Fenwick's hand tightened around the stem of her wineglass until the knuckles showed white against the crystal. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Poirot counted them. No one asked Fenwick what he meant. He did not explain. The conversation resumed about the weather, and the moment was apparently forgotten. But Poirot did not forget it. He turned it over in his mind as he walked in the garden after dinner, his patent leather shoes picking their way along the gravel path that wound between the terraces towards the low stone wall at the cliff's edge. The sea was invisible below, but its presence was everywhere. In the cold air, in the low rhythmic sound that was less a crash than a long, slow exhalation, dear as though the water were breathing. He was standing at the wall, his coat collar raised, when he heard the voices. They came from the far side of a clipped yew hedge. Two voices, low and urgent, the words indistinct, until a shift in the wind carried fragments across. "It was never supposed to happen." And then lower, "You promised." A pause. "If he finds out." Footsteps on the gravel path. The voices ceased cleanly, as though a wireless had been switched off. Poirot did not move. He heard the soft sound of feet on the far side of the hedge, moving in opposite directions, and then the garden was quite still again. He stood a moment longer. The sea breathed below. Somewhere in the house behind him, a window rattled faintly in its frame. He returned to his room and prepared for bed with his customary thoroughness. He was not, it must be said, unduly alarmed. St. Anselm's was a house full of people who had come here to recover from something, and people in the process of recovering from things sometimes said them to each other in gardens at night. This was, perhaps, entirely natural. And yet, there had been a smell in the corridor outside his room when he arrived. He had noticed it as he unpacked and had dismissed it as a trick of the sea air, or perhaps the garden carried in on someone's coat. But he noticed it again as he paused outside his door. Faint, fleeting, bitter almonds. He stood very still in the corridor, one hand on the door handle, his brow slightly furrowed. Then he went inside and lay very carefully in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked in the dark. The sea breathed on, and somewhere in the building, and at precisely 12 minutes past 3 in the morning, Hercule Poirot heard footsteps in the corridor outside his room. They were unhurried, they were careful, and they were, in a manner he could not immediately explain, precisely the wrong kind of quiet. Chapter 2. The Weight of Small Things. The painting of St. Michael had not always hung where it now hung. Poirot established this fact on the morning of his second day, before breakfast, during what he described to himself as a constitutional, and what any observer would have recognized as a systematic inspection of the ground floor. He had paused in the wide corridor outside the sitting room and tilted his head at the painting. A large, rather severe canvas depicting the archangel trampling a rather resigned-looking adversary. And then, at the wall beside it, where a pale rectangle in the wallpaper announced, with the candour of all inanimate things, that the picture had recently been moved some 3 feet to the left. What had it been covering? He stepped closer. The wallpaper beneath the pale rectangle was unbroken. No door, no hatch, no mark of any kind. Nothing, in short, that explained why a painting of 9 square feet should require repositioning. He filed this away and went in to breakfast. The dining room at 8 o'clock held a different character from the dining room at 7:30 in the evening. The light was thin and direct, and it was unkind in the precise way that morning light is always unkind, stripping away the softening effects of candlelight and wine, and leaving people exposed to themselves and one another. Mallory was already seated, alone at the far end of the table, nursing a cup of tea with both hands, as though it were the only warm thing left in the world. He looked up when Poirot entered, offered a small, effortful smile, and looked down again. Poirot took the chair that gave him the best view of the room and accepted coffee from the housemaid with considerable relief. He had not slept well. The footsteps at 3 in the morning had not returned, or if they had been more discreet about it. But the memory of them had kept his mind turning long after it had any productive purpose. Clara Ashcroft arrived next, with a large notebook tucked under one arm and the air of someone whose mind had been engaged for several hours already. She helped herself to toast and sat without ceremony. "You draw at breakfast?" Poirot observed pleasantly. "I observe at breakfast," she said. "I draw later." She opened the notebook and made a swift, economical mark on the page. Poirot, with a detective's instinct for the oblique, did not attempt to see what she was drawing. He would see it when she chose to leave it unguarded, which, if she was the person he was beginning to suspect she might be, she eventually would. Margaret Fenwick came in at 8:15, dressed with that same precise elegance as the evening before, and took the chair farthest from the door. She poured her own tea, refused toast, and opened a letter she had brought down with her. She read it with no visible reaction whatsoever, which told Poirot a considerable amount. Her husband did not appear. "Mr. Fenwick does not join us this morning?" Poirot asked, of no one in particular. "Arthur takes breakfast in his room when his chest is troubling him," Margaret said without looking up from her letter. The damp air. "Ah, I am sorry to hear it." "He is quite used to it." There was a flatness to this that was not quite indifference and not quite resignation. It occupied some territory between the two that Poirot found, on reflection, rather more interesting than either. He spent the morning as a convalescent man reasonably might, sitting in one of the wicker chairs on the veranda, wrapped in a wool blanket that he found personally objectionable but climatically necessary, reading a volume of French essays that he had brought from London. He read very little of it. The veranda was admirably positioned. From it, one could observe the main entrance, the garden path, the door to the dispensary, and the windows of 3 of the guest rooms. A convalescent man interested only in his own recuperation would, of course, notice none of this. Poirot was deeply interested in his recuperation. At 11 o'clock, Nurse Green emerged from the dispensary with a covered tray and crossed the garden towards the east wing. She moved with a nurse's purposeful economy. No wasted steps, no wasted motion. What Poirot noticed was not how she walked, but where she looked. She looked once, sharply, at the window of Mallory's room on the first floor, and then she did not look at it again. A single glance of that particular quality, brief, checked, deliberately not repeated, was more interesting than a lingering stare. "Doctor." Caldwell appeared mid-morning and settled into the adjacent wicker chair, with the air of a man making a professional visit appear casual. "Sleeping well, I hope?" "Tolerably," Poirot said. "The house has certain sounds." "Old houses do." Caldwell crossed his legs and looked out at the sea with the proprietorial satisfaction of a man who has bought this view and finds it continues to justify the expense. "You are comfortable. Is there anything you require?" "There is one small thing," Poirot said pleasantly. "I noticed that the painting in the corridor, St. Michael, has been moved recently. The wallpaper tells me so. I wonder only whether the draught from the window had begun to affect it. Old canvases are susceptible. It was done so lightly, so conversationally, that a man who had nothing to conceal would have answered without thought." Caldwell answered without thought. "Ah, yes, one of the pipes behind that section of wall required attention last week. A precaution only." He smiled. "Nothing dramatic, I'm afraid." "But of course," said Poirot warmly. "I asked only out of regard for the painting." He said nothing more on the subject. After Caldwell had gone inside, Poirot sat for a long moment with his book open in his lap, and his gaze fixed on the middle distance, which happened to be occupied by the sea, which continued to decline to arrange itself tidily. Pipes did not run behind that section of wall. He had examined it that morning. The wall was solid stone. Caldwell had lied. The lie had come quickly and pleasantly, and without any of the small signs, the pause, the shifted gaze, and the fractional delay that characterized an unpracticed liar. This was a man who had answered this kind of question before, or something sufficiently like it, and had long ago prepared his answers. At luncheon, Mallory spoke more than he had the previous evening. He addressed himself primarily to Poirot, with the tentative manner of a man testing the depth of water before committing his weight to it. "You are here at Caldwell's invitation, I understand," he said. "I am." "You know him well?" "We are old acquaintances," Poirot said. "We met some years ago in circumstances that were, shall we say, professionally adjacent. You have been here long, Monsieur Mallory?" 3 weeks. He turned his water glass slowly on the tablecloth. It is very quiet." "You find that agreeable?" Mallory considered this with more care than the question seemed to warrant. "I find it necessary," he said at last. He said nothing further, and Poirot did not press him. But, as the meal concluded and the residents dispersed, Poirot caught Mallory standing in the corridor outside the dining room, quite still, with the look of a man who had decided something. Their eyes met. Mallory opened his mouth. And then Fenwick's heavy tread sounded on the staircase, and whatever Mallory had intended to say retreated behind a polite nod. He went toward his room. Poirot watched him go. The afternoon passed in the grey, suspended manner of afternoons at St. Anselm's. The wind sharpened. 2 of the wicker chairs on the veranda were folded and taken inside. Clara Ashcroft sat in the sitting room and filled 3 pages of her notebook with small, rapid sketches, which she closed promptly when Margaret Fenwick entered and asked with careful lightness what she was drawing. "Nothing in particular," Clara said. Margaret Fenwick sat down. She looked at the closed notebook for a moment before she looked away. "I believe we have met before," she said, "some years ago, at a house in Wiltshire." "I don't think so," Clara said pleasantly. "No," Margaret agreed after a pause. "Perhaps not." Poirot, who had been reading in the corner armchair with the dedicated invisibility that small, neat, foreign-looking men can sometimes achieve in English sitting rooms, turned a page of his book with unruffled serenity. Neither woman had been in Wiltshire. They both knew it. And they both knew that the other knew it, which was, in its way, the most informative exchange he had witnessed since his arrival. He went upstairs before dinner to change his collar. As he turned the corner of the first-floor corridor, he saw something that made him stop. The door to Mallory's room stood half an inch ajar. A faint sound came from within. Not movement exactly, but the particular quality of stillness that occupies a room when someone is standing in it and not wishing to be heard. Poirot went to his own room, closed his door quietly, and stood just inside it for a moment. Someone had been in Mallory's room. The question was not difficult to formulate. It was whether they had been leaving something or taking it away. Chapter 3. The Orderly Death. He was found at 7:45 in the morning by the housemaid who brought his tea. She set the tray on the bedside table, drew back the curtains, turned and screamed, not loudly, but with the concentrated intensity of someone who has never screamed before and finds the experience deeply inconvenient. Nurse Green arrived within 90 seconds. Dr. Caldwell within 3 minutes. By the time Poirot reached the doorway, having dressed with somewhat less ceremony than was his custom, the scene had already assumed the composed, institutional quality that death acquires when medical people are present to manage it. Edward Mallory sat in the armchair beside the window. He was dressed in his day clothes, which was the first thing Poirot noticed. Not his night clothes, his day clothes. The same grey suit he had worn to luncheon, the same unremarkable tie. He sat with his chin dropped forward and his hands resting open on his knees, palms upward, in a posture that was almost, but not quite, one of repose. A glass on the bedside table contained the pale residue of a sleeping tonic. The window beside him looked out over the garden and the grey morning sea beyond it, which was doing what the sea at St. Anselm's always did, regardless of circumstance. Caldwell straightened from his examination and spoke in the measured tones of a physician delivering an expected verdict. Heart failure, I'm afraid. He had a significant cardiac weakness. It was noted on his admission. The sleeping tonic he took each evening would have helped him rest, but in a man of his condition, it cannot prevent the heart from doing what the heart will ultimately do. He looked at no one in particular. It was, I think, quite peaceful. There were murmurs of the appropriate sort. Margaret Fenwick, standing in the doorway in her dressing gown with her hair not yet arranged, pressed her lips together briefly and said, "Poor man." It was the correct thing to say, and she said it correctly. Clara Ashcroft, who had come to stand beside Poirot, said nothing at all, but he heard the faint, controlled sound of her breath. Arthur Fenwick had not appeared. Nurse Green drew a sheet over Mallory with the practiced efficiency of a woman performing a task that has no good version, but can at least be performed with dignity. Then she collected the glass from the bedside table. "Leave that, if you please," said Poirot. Everyone looked at him. It was, he was aware, the first time he had spoken. Nurse Green held the glass and looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at Poirot with an expression of courteous inquiry that contained, at its edges, something a great deal less courteous. "My dear Poirot," he said, "surely there is no need." "Humour an old man," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is a habit of mine. I find that I am always made uneasy by the removal of objects from rooms where a death has occurred, until I have had a little time to think about them. It is a peculiarity." He smiled with great warmth. "You will forgive it, I am sure." Caldwell smiled back. "Of course," he said. The glass remained. They dispersed to dress, to breakfast, to the particular business of a household rearranging itself around an absence. Poirot returned to the room alone 20 minutes later, when the corridor was quiet. He stood in the doorway first and looked at the room as a whole, because a room, examined from the threshold before one enters and disturbs it, will sometimes offer a version of itself that is no longer available once one has walked about in it. The armchair, the bedside table, the wardrobe whose door stood open a precise 2 inches, the window latched, the rug before the chair which lay at a slight angle to the floorboards, as though it had been displaced and replaced without great care for its original orientation. Then he went in. He looked at the glass first. The residue at the bottom was thin, faintly yellowish. He did not smell it. He did not need to. He straightened and looked at the floor beside the chair, and he saw it. Fragments. 4 of them, small and curved, gleaming faintly against the dark floorboards near the leg of the armchair. He crouched, somewhat carefully, and as his knees had not forgiven him for Cornwall, and examined them without touching. Glass, thin glass, the kind from which a drinking vessel is made. He stood and examined the glass on the bedside table again. It was intact. It was, in fact, the sort of thick, institutional tumbler that convalescent houses favour, precisely because they do not shatter easily. These fragments on the floor were something different, thinner, more delicate, the remnant of a quite different vessel. Mallory had held something in his hand and dropped it, or it had been taken from his hand before it fell, and an imperfect job made of the subsequent tidying. Poirot left the fragments where they lay and turned his attention to the bedside table. The sleeping tonic bottle stood beside the tumbler, the cork replaced. A library book. A folded handkerchief, plain white, initialed in blue thread. He examined the initials with care. They were clear and neatly worked. M.F. He looked at this for rather a long time. Then he took a sheet of paper from the writing table in the corner, folded it twice, and used it to lift the handkerchief without obscuring the initials. He carried it to the window where the pale morning light was more useful. The embroidery was old. The thread had the faint, softened quality of something laundered many times. The linen itself was fine, a woman's handkerchief, though not a small one. The initials were monogrammed in a style that had been fashionable perhaps 15 years ago. M. F. Margaret Fenwick. He replaced it precisely as he had found it and stood for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, regarding the room with an expression that an observer might have described as mild and contemplative, and which was neither. At breakfast, the conversation was careful. People ate because not eating would have required an explanation, and no one wished to be required to explain themselves. Caldwell spoke of the arrangements that would need to be made, the notifications that would be necessary. His tone was that of a competent administrator. Margaret Fenwick asked whether Mallory had any family, and Caldwell said there was a sister in Edinburgh, he believed. Clara Ashcroft ate half a piece of toast and spent the remainder of the meal looking at the space above the window frame with the abstracted attention of a woman composing something in her head. It was Arthur Fenwick who introduced the difficulty. He came down to breakfast late, moving with the careful deliberation of a large man who has decided to economize his energy. He poured his coffee, he surveyed the table, and then he said, with the same conversational flatness with which he delivered all his observations, "I understand there was a handkerchief found in the dead man's room. Margaret's handkerchief." The silence this time was of a different quality from the one at dinner 2 evenings before. That silence had been merely uncomfortable. This one had edges. "Where did you hear that?" Margaret asked. "The housemaid mentioned it to George in the hall." He lifted his coffee cup. "Is it true?" "It is not mine," Margaret said. Fenwick looked at her steadily. "I see." "It is not mine," she said again, with the particular emphasis of someone who is aware that repetition is not the same as persuasion. Poirot buttered a piece of toast with great attention and said, in the mild, peripheral tone of a man making an observation of no great importance, "It is curious, is it not, that a handkerchief embroidered with initials should be disowned by the person whose initials appear upon it. But then," he added pleasantly, setting down his knife, "initials are not, of course, so very exclusive a form of identification. M.F. might stand for many things." No one asked him what things. He ate his toast. The sea made its vast, indifferent sound below the cliffs. And Poirot, who had been considering the dead man's upturned palms since 7:45 that morning, turned over in his mind the one detail that troubled him above all others. A man dying quietly of heart failure in his armchair in the night does not put on his day suit first. He dresses for something, or for someone. He had been waiting. The question was simply whether he had known what was coming or only hoped for something else entirely. Chapter 4. What the Garden Remembered. By midday, St. Anselm's had settled into the particular hush that follows a death on the premises. Not grief, precisely, since Mallory had been known to no one there in any intimate sense, but a collective reticence, as though the house itself had lowered its voice out of respect for the occasion. Dr. Caldwell had telephoned the appropriate parties. A local physician, Dr. Trewin from the village, had been summoned to countersign the death certificate. He was a brisk, sandy-haired man of 50 who smelled of pipe tobacco and did not appear to find anything remarkable in the business. He examined the body, spoke with Caldwell for 6 minutes in the corridor outside Mallory's room, signed the necessary papers, and departed. The whole transaction had the efficient sorrow of something done before. Poirot watched from the sitting-room window as Trewin's motorcar disappeared down the drive. Then he went to find the garden. Not for air. He had sufficient air. He went because a garden in October, when the beds are cleared and the paths are visible, and no one is inclined to linger decoratively beside the roses, is an honest place. It shows you what it has. He walked the full perimeter of the grounds with his hands behind his back, and his eyes on the paths rather than the view. Gravel held impressions poorly in dry weather, but the narrow grass margin between the path and the yew hedges was another matter. And near the section of hedge behind which he had heard the voices 2 evenings before, the grass was marked. 2 distinct areas of compression, perhaps 18 inches apart, where someone had stood long enough to leave an impression. The feet had been close together, the stance of a person standing still, not pacing. And beside one set of marks, a third smaller impression. A heel turned outward. Someone had pivoted sharply and moved away. He continued to the east wall of the garden, where a wooden door, presumably leading to the kitchen yard, stood closed but unlatched. Beyond it, the flagstone path that served the tradesman's entrance ran parallel to the building before rejoining the main drive. A person wishing to leave or enter the house at an irregular hour without crossing the main hall could do so very conveniently by this route. He stood at the door for a moment, then turned back and examined the flower beds running beneath the east wing windows. Most were well tended, the soil turned and mulched for winter. But in the bed directly below what he had calculated to be the window of the dispensary, the soil was disturbed in a manner inconsistent with routine gardening. Less a turning than a pressing, as though something had rested there and been retrieved. Or placed. He crouched and studied the bed without touching it. The shape was suggestive of a flat, rectangular object. A box, perhaps, of moderate dimensions, or a case of the sort used to carry medical instruments. He rose, brushed his knees, and went inside to find Nurse Green. She was in the dispensary, writing in a ledger with the concentrated application of someone who finds comfort in columns and figures. She looked up when Poirot appeared in the doorway and set her pen down with a promptness that was, in itself, a form of attention. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope I do not disturb you." He settled into the chair across from her desk. The visitor's chair, placed there, he noted, with the same institutional precision as everything else in the room, and folded his hands in his lap. "I wished only to ask a small thing. The sleeping tonic that Mr. Mallory took each evening. Was it prepared here in this room?" It was. She met his eyes without difficulty. A standard compound, prescribed by Dr. Caldwell and prepared according to his instructions. "And the bottle beside Mr. Mallory's bed. Was it prepared fresh each evening or supplied in advance?" "It was prepared on Monday for the week, a week's supply, bottled and labelled." A pause, the smallest fraction longer than strictly necessary. "Dr. Caldwell is very organised in his methods." "Indeed." Poirot looked about the room with the benign, appreciating air of a man admiring a well-kept space. The shelves were orderly, the labels forward-facing, the glass-fronted cabinet at the far end locked. "And the cabinet, is it always locked?" "Always. I hold one key. Dr. Caldwell holds the other." "2 keys only?" "2 keys only." "You have been a nurse for many years, I think," Poirot said in quite a different tone, quieter, more conversational, the tone one uses when a question is not really a question. One develops in that time a sensitivity to one's patients, to their states of mind, to changes in their, how shall I say, their spiritual weather. Did Mr. Mallory seem to you, in the days before his death, like a man who was worried about something? The quality of her stillness changed. Not much, but enough. "He was a man recovering from a serious illness," she said carefully. "Such men are often not entirely themselves." "That is a very measured answer, Nurse Green." "It is an accurate one." Accuracy and completeness are not always the same thing. He rose from the chair and smiled at her with great cordiality. "Thank you. You have been most helpful." She had told him very little. But the things she had chosen not to say were, taken together, quite substantial. He was crossing the entrance hall on his way upstairs when Margaret Fenwick appeared at the top of the staircase and descended with the air of a woman who has decided upon something. She reached the bottom step and looked at Poirot directly. "I should like to speak with you," she said, "privately." He led her to the small writing room at the end of the ground-floor corridor, which was used by residents for correspondence, and which was, at this hour, empty. She sat in one of the straight-backed chairs and arranged herself with that familiar precision, though today the precision had a strained quality, as though it required more effort than usual. "The handkerchief," she said without preliminary. "I told the truth. It is not mine. I have not carried handkerchiefs with that monogram for 8 years." Poirot waited. "My name before my marriage was Margaret Forsyth," she said. "M.F. Do you see? The handkerchief is from before. I gave a number of them away when I changed my circumstances. I cannot account for how one came to be in Mr. Mallory's possession." She paused. "I am telling you this because you will discover it regardless, and I prefer that you hear it from me." "That is very sensible of you, Madame Fenwick," Poirot said. "May I ask one thing more? You told me when I arrived that the first thing you noticed upon entering St. Anselm's was the silence. But you have been here before, have you not? Before your marriage." The colour in her face shifted almost imperceptibly. "That is a considerable leap, Monsieur Poirot." "It is a small step, in fact. You know where everything is kept. You do not ask for directions. On your first evening you went directly to the garden by a route that is not signposted, and that a newcomer would not naturally find. And when Nurse Green enters a room, you do not look at her as one looks at a stranger. He tilted his head slightly. You looked at her as one looks at a person one hoped never to see again. Margaret Fenwick was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved along the cliff edge and the house absorbed it, as it absorbed everything into its long, patient silence. "I was employed here," she said at last. "Before it was St. Anselm's, when it was still in private hands." She looked at her lap. "I was a governess." "To whom?" She raised her eyes. In them, Poirot saw not evasion, but the particular weariness of someone who has carried a weight for so long that setting it down has begun to seem more frightening than continuing to bear it. "To Arthur Fenwick's daughter," she said. "To Eleanor." The name settled into the room like something dropped into still water. "She was a good child," Margaret said very quietly. "Whatever else was true, she was a good child." Poirot said nothing. He had found over many years that nothing was frequently the most useful thing one could say. He merely waited while the house creaked softly around them, and the name of a dead girl hung in the cold air of a room that had been keeping secrets long before either of them arrived. Chapter 5. Confessions. Within confessions. Eleanor Fenwick had died 10 years ago in the month of March. They were at the age of 19 in circumstances that the newspapers had described as a tragic accident, and the inquest had returned an open verdict upon, and which no one, apparently, had seen fit to discuss publicly since. Poirot had not known this when he arrived at St. Anselm's. He knew it now because Margaret Fenwick, having once begun to speak the girl's name, found that she could not easily stop. The words came not in a rush, but in the measured, deliberate way of a person who has rehearsed a confession so many times in private that delivering it aloud feels less like revelation than like reading from a prepared text. Eleanor had been Arthur Fenwick's daughter by his first wife, who had died when the child was 4. She had been clever, sensitive, and possessed of a persistent cough that her father had taken with great seriousness, and her doctors had taken with rather less. When Eleanor was 18, Arthur Fenwick had brought Dr. Leonard Caldwell to the house. Not to this house, which had not yet become St. Anselm's, but to Fenwick's principal residence in Wiltshire, to conduct what Caldwell had described as an assessment of the girl's constitution. The assessment had extended over 2 months. It had involved a course of treatment of which Margaret, then employed as governess, had been given no precise account. Eleanor had grown worse, not better. In March of the following year she had died. Cardiac failure, the death certificate stated. She was 19, Margaret said. She played the piano. She was very fond of larks. She paused. People who are very fond of larks are not people who die of cardiac failure at 19. Poirot, who had been sitting in careful stillness throughout, asked, "What do you believe caused her death, Madame Fenwick?" "I believe," Margaret said in a tone of enormous precision, "that she was given something that her heart was not strong enough to bear. And I believe that the man who gave it to her was very well aware of that fact beforehand, and chose to proceed regardless." "And Mallory?" She looked at her hands. Edward Mallory was Fenwick's solicitor at the time. He handled the inquest documentation. Certain irregularities in the medical records were brought to his attention. He chose not to act on them. He was paid very generously for that choice. A pause. I know this because he told me so himself 3 days ago. He came to find me in the garden. He said he could not carry it any longer. He intended to confess. He intended to write to the proper authorities. He had the documents with him, copies he had kept, God knows why, as an insurance perhaps, or as a form of penance he had not yet found the courage to complete. Her voice was level and entirely without pity, though Poirot was not certain at whom the absence of pity was directed. He asked me whether I would corroborate his account. I told him I needed time to consider. That was the last proper conversation we had. And the handkerchief? For the first time, something uncertain crossed her face. I gave him that handkerchief during our conversation. It was cold and he had no pocket square. One of the old ones, from before. I had not realized I still had it. She looked up. He kept it. Poirot turned this over with great care, like a man examining a coin he is not certain is genuine. It had the quality of truth, the texture of it, the small, undramatic particularity. And yet, "You will forgive me," he said gently, "but I must ask. You visited his room the night he died. At what hour?" She did not deny it. 10:30. I had decided. I went to tell him I would corroborate everything. I knocked. There was no answer. The door was not latched. She stopped. He was already in the chair. I thought he was asleep. I left. You did not check whether he breathed? I was frightened. The composure cracked very slightly at its edges. I am not proud of it. I was frightened and I left. Poirot nodded once without judgment and rose. He thanked her and went upstairs. He sat in his room for 20 minutes without moving, which was how he did his best thinking. Then he put on his coat and went to call upon Clara Ashcroft. She received him in the sitting room, her notebook closed on the table beside her, her hands folded over it in a way that was not quite casual. She was, he thought, a woman who had been expecting this visit and had prepared herself for it. Not by rehearsing answers, but by deciding, somewhere along the way, to abandon the performance of recovery she had been maintaining since her arrival, and simply speak plainly. She was the one who spoke first. "My husband's name was Robert Ashcroft," she said. "He was an engineer. For 11 years he worked for a subsidiary of Fenwick Industries, a foundry in the Midlands. In the autumn of 1921, there was an accident, a structural failure. 4 men were killed." She did not look away from Poirot's face. Robert believed the failure was not an accident. He believed the supporting framework had been constructed to an inadequate specification in order to reduce costs, and that this was known to the company's management, including Fenwick himself. He brought this belief to someone's attention. He wrote letters. He spoke to a journalist. He engaged a solicitor, not Mallory, another man, who took his fees and accomplished nothing. Her voice was without bitterness, which was more disturbing than bitterness would have been. Bitterness, at least, implies that one still expects something from the world. Fenwick Industries produced documentation suggesting the failure was the result of Robert's own engineering errors. Robert was dismissed. We lost our savings in the legal proceedings. He could not find further employment in his field. She glanced at the closed notebook. He died in the spring of 1924. They called it a self-inflicted death, which is an admirably neutral way of describing something that was not neutral at all. "People say silence is peaceful," Poirot said quietly, repeating her own words back to her from some earlier exchange. Not deliberately, but because they had stayed with him. She looked at him sharply. "Yes," she said, "but silence can suffocate." "You came here to paint?" he asked, though he was not by this point asking it entirely as a question. "I came here because Arthur Fenwick was here." She opened the notebook to a page near the middle and turned it towards him without ceremony. The page was filled with sketches, rapidly executed but precise. Fenwick's hands, the broad knuckles, the weight of the fingers around a glass, the particular curl of them when he rested them flat on the table. A dozen studies of the same subject, approaching it from different angles, as though trying to find the angle from which it would yield something. "I wanted to understand him," she said. "I have been trying to understand him for 2 years. How a man who has done what he has done continues to occupy a room, to eat his breakfast, to comment on the weather." She closed the notebook. "I have not succeeded." Poirot regarded her with an expression that contained, beneath its surface neutrality, a profound and complicated respect. "You did not come here to harm him," he said. "It was not a question." "No," she said simply. "I came here to look at him, and to decide whether the looking was enough." A brief pause. "I had not yet decided when Mallory died." When Poirot left her and crossed the entrance hall toward the staircase, he nearly walked directly into Arthur Fenwick, who was descending with his habitual deliberate weight, one hand on the banister. The two men regarded each other for a moment in the narrow space. "I wonder," Poirot said pleasantly, "whether you might spare me a few minutes this afternoon, Monsieur Fenwick, at your convenience, naturally." Fenwick studied him the way he studied everything, with the calm, assessing patience of a man who has never needed to hurry a decision in his life. "I know who you are," he said. "Not merely a convalescent." "No," Poirot agreed affably. "Nor, I think, are you." A silence passed between them that was quite different in character from the silences Poirot had observed at the dinner table. Those had been silences of concealment. This one had the quality of two players setting out their pieces before the opening move. 3 o'clock, Fenwick said, and continued down the stairs. Poirot watched him go and noted with interest that the hand resting on the banister, though its grip was composed and deliberate, had whitened very slightly at the knuckles. Arthur Fenwick, it appeared, was not entirely without nerves. That was, in its way, the most useful thing Poirot had yet discovered. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Denial. Arthur Fenwick received Poirot in his room at 3 o'clock, precisely, which was the first indication that the interview mattered to him. Men who do not care about a conversation arrive a little late to it. Men who are afraid arrive early. Fenwick was standing at the window when Poirot entered, his back to the door, looking out at the sea with the expression of someone who has selected his position in advance and intends to conduct proceedings from it. He turned when Poirot entered and gestured to the 2 chairs arranged before the fireplace with a host's ease that, in a man occupying a room in someone else's house, was itself a kind of statement. The room was larger than Poirot's own. A leather writing case lay open on the desk. 2 empty glasses stood on the side table, which told Poirot that Fenwick had anticipated company, and had then, on reflection, decided against the formality of offering it. They sat. "You have been talking to my wife," Fenwick said. "Why, I have spoken with a number of people," Poirot replied equably. "It is my habit. I find that people, when spoken to, are frequently illuminating." "And what have you been illuminated about?" "Many things. The history of this house, the late Mr. Mallory's anxieties, the nature of old mistakes. Poirot settled back with the air of a man entirely comfortable, which he was not entirely. "I should like, if you will permit it, to speak about your daughter." Nothing in Fenwick's face changed. This, Poirot reflected, was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of considerable practice. A man learns to hold his face still only if he has had prolonged reason to do so. "Eleanor died 10 years ago," Fenwick said, "of a cardiac condition." "So the death certificate states." "Death certificates," Fenwick said carefully, "are generally state what is true." "They state what is written upon them," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "The two things overlap considerably, but not always completely." He paused. "You were fond of your daughter, I think." The question, framed as it was, not as a challenge but as a simple human inquiry, appeared to cost Fenwick something. His jaw set very slightly. "Extremely." "Then the treatment you sought for her was motivated by genuine concern for her welfare." "Everything I have ever done for Eleanor was motivated by genuine concern for her welfare." The flatness was back, but with an altered quality, harder, as though laid over something that was not flat at all. "I engaged the best physician available. Caldwell came highly recommended. His methods were unconventional, but he had results that the orthodox men did not. And when the results in Eleanor's case were less than hoped for, she had an undetected weakness in the heart. Caldwell informed me of this after her death. It was a congenital condition. Nothing he had administered could have been foreseen to cause the outcome it did." Fenwick's voice was steady and factual, the voice of a man repeating something he has examined from every angle over many years and determined to be structurally sound. "That is the truth." Poirot regarded him with an expression of mild, courteous attention. "Monsieur Fenwick, you are a man who has built considerable things in his life. Factories, industries, reputations. A man of that accomplishment understands that a structure is only as reliable as its foundation." He folded his hands. "Even the foundation of that truth, was it examined by independent eyes, or only by Dr. Caldwell's own account of his own conduct?" A silence of some duration. "Mallory examined the documentation," Fenwick said at last. "Ah, yes, Mallory." Poirot nodded slowly. "And Mallory, you have known for some years, was not an independent eye at all." Fenwick rose from his chair with the deliberate movement of a large man choosing not to use the full weight of his displeasure. He went to the window again. Below, the garden path was empty, the yew hedges dark against the pale afternoon sky. "What is it that you want, Monsieur Poirot?" "I want nothing for myself," Poirot said. "I want only to understand what happened to Mr. Mallory. And what happened 10 years earlier to Eleanor. Those are separate matters." "I am not certain they are." Fenwick was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice. Not softened precisely, but altered in density, as stone alters when it has absorbed a great deal of water over a long time. "I paid to ensure discretion," he said. "After Eleanor died, I paid because I could not bear the public examination of it. A father's grief is not a spectacle." He turned from the window. "Whatever Mallory has told you, or whoever else has told you, I did not kill my daughter. I tried to save her. The fact that I also attempted to protect the physician who failed to save her is a separate and a lesser thing." "Did you visit Mallory's room on the night he died?" The directness of it arrived in the room without ceremony, and Fenwick absorbed it in the same way. "I did," he said after a moment. "Earlier in the evening, he had sent me a note asking to speak. I went at 9 o'clock. He told me what he intended to do. Write to the authorities. Surrender his copies of the documents." His chin lifted fractionally. "I told him to do as his conscience demanded, and I left him alive and in reasonable health." This, Poirot noted, had the unornamented quality of the truth. It also raised with some urgency the question of who had arrived at Mallory's room after 9 o'clock and before 10:30, when Margaret had found him already in his chair. He thanked Fenwick and excused himself. He was considering this window of time with great concentration as he descended the stairs, which is perhaps why he did not, until he reached the landing, smell it. A sharper quality to the air near the corridor that led to the resident's sitting room. Not the salt and antiseptic breath of the house's ordinary atmosphere, but something thinner, more chemical. He turned toward it and followed it to the sitting room doorway, where he stopped. Arthur Fenwick's afternoon tea tray had been set on the low table before the armchairs, as it was every day at this hour. The teapot, the cup, the small jug of milk. Fenwick had not yet come down to take it. Poirot crossed to the tray and crouched over it. His eyes moved to the cup, which was clean and empty, and then to the saucer beneath it, upon which a faint residue of white powder lay in a thin ring where something had been placed, and then removed. He did not touch it. He straightened and looked at the room carefully. The door to the corridor, the window to the garden, both of which could be reached from the east passage without crossing the main hall. Nurse Green appeared in the doorway behind him with Fenwick's afternoon medication on a small tray. She looked at Poirot and then at the tea tray, and something moved across her face with great speed and was controlled. "He has not come down yet," she said. "No," Poirot agreed. "He has not." He turned to face her fully. "Nurse Green, I wonder whether you would be good enough to remain here for a moment while I fetch Dr. Caldwell." She set her own tray down on the side table with a steady hand. "Of course," she said. But she did not look at Poirot when she said it. She looked at the tea tray, and the expression on her face, held carefully neutral, was not quite the expression of a woman who had just noticed something unexpected. It was, Poirot thought, the expression of a woman looking at something she already knew was there. Chapter 7. The Uses of Misdirection. Dr. Caldwell took one look at the powder on the saucer, said, "Good God," in a tone that struck Poirot as marginally too emphatic, and immediately summoned Nurse Green to dispose of the tea tray entirely. Poirot said nothing to prevent this. He had already seen what he needed to see, and preventing Caldwell from managing the scene would only have put the man on guard before Poirot was ready for him to be. The teapot went, the cup went, the saucer and its faint residue went. Fenwick, informed of what had been found in his sitting-room tea tray, received the news with the particular stillness of a man in whom the instinct to be alarmed and the instinct to show nothing have so long been in competition that neither now wins decisively. He asked two questions: whether the powder had been analysed, and whether anyone had been in the sitting-room unobserved that afternoon. He received unsatisfactory answers to both, nodded once, and requested that a fresh pot of tea be brought to his room. Caldwell called it a prank. An unpleasant one, he said, looking uncomfortable but not necessarily sinister. The powder, he ventured, was in all likelihood nothing more alarming than one of the mild herbal tonics available in the dispensary, left there by accident or misunderstanding. Poirot listened to this explanation with an air of benign acceptance and a quantity of private skepticism that he kept scrupulously to himself. That evening he sat alone in his room for a considerable time before dinner, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his eyes directed at the middle distance occupied by the wardrobe door, which was closed and gave nothing back. He was thinking about the smell. Not the smell from the tea tray, which had been faint and chemical, and which he had catalogued and set aside. He was thinking about the smell he had noticed on his first evening. The bitter almonds in the corridor outside his room. He had, as a professional matter, associated it with cyanide, because cyanide is what one associates with bitter almonds. And bitter almonds are what one writes about in detective fiction and hears about from toxicologists in the witness box. But cyanide does not produce a quiet death in an armchair. Cyanide is not quiet at all. He had known this in the part of his mind that was always working since the first morning. He had known it and had set it aside because the bitter almond smell was there, and the connections one's mind makes with bitter almond smells are deep and habitual and not easily interrupted. Someone had understood this very well. The smell had been placed in that corridor to direct the nose, and through the nose, the mind, toward a particular conclusion. A conclusion that would cause any investigating intelligence to spend its energy looking for the wrong thing entirely, asking the wrong questions of the wrong people, or examining the wrong cabinet, considering the wrong compound. The real poison was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was something quiet, cumulative, and medically plausible. A compound that, administered in small quantities over several days into the sleeping tonic of a man with a documented cardiac weakness, would produce precisely the death that had occurred. A man in a chair, a heart that had simply ceased, no violence, no distress, visible to any but the most attentive eye, and the shattered glass on the floor. Mallory had been awake when it happened, had understood, or begun to understand, in the last moments. The glass had been the signal he attempted to send, not the handkerchief. The handkerchief had been placed deliberately in the moment when his mind was still clear enough to act with purpose. And the glass had shattered because his body had lost its control before his intention had. He had been trying, right to the end, to tell someone. Poirot thought about the refilled medicine bottle. He had noted this detail several days ago and had allowed it to remain like a marked card in a deck until the hand was further along. The bottle beside Mallory's bed had been full to a level inconsistent with a week's supply diminished by several days of nightly doses. Someone had refilled it, not restored it to its original contents, but replaced the remaining tonic with something that contained an additional element. Only 2 people held keys to the cabinet where the dispensary medicines were kept. Poirot went down to dinner. He was, by this point, quite certain who had killed Edward Mallory. He had been certain, and in the way that one is certain about these things, before the proof is fully assembled since the previous afternoon. What he required now was not additional conviction, but something more useful. The final thread that would render the mechanism of the crime visible in its entirety, so that when the moment came for explanation, it would be explanation and not conjecture. The thread presented itself at the dinner table from an entirely unexpected direction. Clara Ashcroft set down her water glass, looked at the centre of the table and said quietly, to no one in particular, "My husband used to say that the most dangerous people in the world are those who have convinced themselves their crime was a kindness." Nobody acknowledged it as a direct remark. That was the convention at St. Anselm's. One spoke into the middle of the table and allowed others to decide whether to receive the words. But Poirot watched the faces as she said it. Margaret Fenwick looked at her plate with an expression of recognition. Arthur Fenwick looked at Clara with an expression of, not anger, something older than anger. The exhausted attentiveness of a man who has spent a decade having the same argument with himself. And Dr. Caldwell looked at Clara Ashcroft for precisely 3 seconds with an expression that Poirot would not have been able to name in English, but which in French he might have called a man confronted by the mirror he has been carefully avoiding. Then Caldwell reached for the bread basket and remarked on the weather. After dinner, Poirot found the occasion to spend 7 minutes alone in the dispensary. He did not need to force the lock on the glass-fronted cabinet, because earlier in the day, while Caldwell was occupied with the matter of Fenwick's tea tray, Poirot had borrowed, with a dexterity that age had not entirely deprived him of, a brief examination of the key on Caldwell's key ring. It was a simple ward lock, and Poirot had not been a detective for 40 years, without having accumulated certain secondary competencies that his doctor would have found disconcerting. Inside the cabinet, on the second shelf, beside the prepared stock of sleeping tonics, he found a small, dark glass bottle without a label. It contained perhaps a third of its original capacity. He unstoppered it, held it to the light, and observed the faint, viscous quality of the remaining liquid. He did not smell it, because he already knew what it was. He recorded in his mind the position of every item on every shelf, restored the bottle to its precise location, locked the cabinet, and left the room. Then he walked to the end of the corridor and stood for a moment with his back to the wall, his eyes closed, his magnificent moustache absolutely still, the bitter almond smell, the moved painting, the pressed soil beneath the dispensary window, the refilled bottle, the unlabeled vial, the footsteps at 3 in the morning made by someone who knew the floorboards well enough to avoid the 3 that creaked, someone who had walked this corridor not once, but many times. Only one man had walked these corridors for years. Only one man had both the knowledge to administer a slow cardiac depressant undetected, and the standing to ensure that the death would be managed with institutional smoothness, the papers signed by an obliging local physician, the tray removed before it could be analysed, the narrative of natural causes protected at every turn. And only one man had, woven through everything, the fundamental and terrible motive that was not greed, not malice, but something far more dangerous. The absolute conviction that he knew best. Tomorrow, Poirot decided, he would set the trap. Tonight, he returned to his room and sat beside his window. The sea breathed in the dark below the cliffs, vast and indifferent and patient, as it had been breathing before any of them arrived, and would go on breathing long after the last of them had gone. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not find it disordered at all this evening. He found it honest. Chapter 8. The Mirror Shatters. He arranged it for 11 o'clock in the morning, which was the hour at which St. Anselm's was at its most composed. Breakfast had been cleared. The housemaids had finished their upper-floor duties, and retreated to the kitchen regions. The garden was empty. The residents by this hour were in the sitting room or on the veranda, occupying themselves with the particular careful industry of people who have run out of ordinary things to say to one another, and have not yet decided what to do about it. Poirot asked Caldwell, in a tone of mild professional curiosity, whether he might convene a brief meeting of the household. A small matter of administration, he explained, for the medicine cabinet had been found unlocked on 2 occasions. A potential breach of the clinic's protocols that ought to be addressed with all relevant parties present. He felt sure Caldwell would wish to put residents' minds at rest. Caldwell agreed, and the expression with which he agreed was, to Poirot's eye, that of a man who has been told the hour of his appointment and has decided, with great discipline, not to run. They gathered in the sitting room at 11, Caldwell standing near the mantelpiece, Nurse Green in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, Arthur Fenwick occupying the larger armchair with the settled authority of a man who sits in large chairs, as a matter of course. Margaret Fenwick took the chair beside the writing table and produced from somewhere the appearance of composure. Clara Ashcroft sat near the door with her notebook closed on the cushion beside her, as though she had brought it for company and then thought better of opening it. Poirot positioned himself at the centre of the room, beside the low table upon which he had placed, without comment or explanation, the medicine bottle from Mallory's bedside. He began, as was his custom, not at the beginning. "There is a thing about this house," he said, addressing the middle distance in the manner of a man thinking aloud, "that I have been considering since my first evening here. It is a house designed for silence, for recovery, for the careful management of difficult things." He turned slowly, taking them all in without appearing to fix upon any one of them. "It is also, I have come to understand, a house that has been managed with rather more deliberateness than is usual." No one spoke. The fire in the grate ticked. "The sleeping tonic prepared for Mr. Mallory," Poirot continued, lifting the bottle from the table and turning it in the light, "was prepared here in this dispensary, from this stock. It was, as Nurse Green has confirmed, prepared on Monday for the week. A week's supply." He set it down again. "When Mr. Mallory was found on Thursday morning, this bottle was full. Not partially depleted, as 3 days of nightly doses would have made it. Full." He paused. "It had been refilled." Caldwell said, "Poirot," in a tone intended to suggest patient, professional tolerance of an amateur's conclusions. Poirot raised one finger gently and continued, "And the bottle was refilled with a preparation that resembled the original in appearance and in taste. What it contained additionally was a slow cardiac depressant. A compound that, in a man with Mallory's documented weakness of the heart, would produce the effect of natural cardiac failure over a period of some hours. Quiet, orderly, perfectly consistent with the known medical history of the patient." He turned to Caldwell directly for the first time. "It is a compound requiring precise knowledge of pharmacology and exact understanding of the patient's cardiac condition. It is not something administered carelessly or in ignorance. It was administered by someone who understood, with complete clarity, what the outcome would be." "You cannot possibly," Caldwell began. "There is a bottle in your dispensary cabinet," Poirot said. "On the second shelf, without a label, which contains the remaining quantity of this preparation. I examined it last evening. The room was very still. Furthermore, Poirot said, and here his voice acquired the quiet, inexorable quality of something that has been building pressure for a long time. I wish to speak of the smell of bitter almonds that I detected on my first night here. It was present in the corridor outside my room, and it was present nowhere else. It was not cyanide. It was a deliberate introduction. Laurel water, most probably, which carries the same scent and which is entirely harmless in the quantity required to produce it. It was placed there to suggest one thing to any investigating mind: that this was a poisoning case involving cyanide. He allowed a brief silence. It was a misdirection of considerable ingenuity. It assumed correctly that a detective's instinct, once engaged upon the smell of bitter almonds, would be inclined to look for that particular poison and might overlook the quite different compound that had actually done its work. Clara Ashcroft had turned her face toward Caldwell. Her expression was not triumphant. It was something harder to name. The look of a person watching a structure come down that they have long known to be unsound, and finding the sight neither satisfying nor entirely bearable. Margaret Fenwick had not moved. Fenwick himself was looking at Caldwell with an expression that Poirot would not have wished to be on the receiving end of, and which Caldwell was receiving without meeting it. "You painted the bitter almond scent in the corridor," Poirot said to Caldwell. "On the same evening you moved the sleeping tonic preparation. You moved the painting of St. Michael to access the section of wall behind which you concealed, temporarily, the instrument case you used. The same case you later retrieved and which left its impression in the flower bed beneath the dispensary window." He paused. "The footsteps in the corridor at 3 a.m. were yours. You had gone to verify that the dose had taken its effect." Caldwell placed his hand on the mantelpiece. It was not quite a gesture of support. "You have constructed a very elaborate theory," he said. His voice was admirably controlled. Admirably. But the word elaborate had been chosen to diminish, and the choosing of it told Poirot that denial had been decided upon, at least for the present. "I have constructed nothing," Poirot replied. "I have assembled what was already there. There is a difference, mon ami, and it is an important one." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. "Mallory kept copies of the documentation he intended to submit to the authorities. Copies that passed, upon his death, into the possession of a third party to whom he had entrusted them in the event that anything prevented him from acting himself." He set the paper on the table. "I received them by the morning post 2 days ago." This was not entirely true in its timing, but it was entirely true in its substance, and the distinction was one that only Poirot was in a position to appreciate. Caldwell looked at the paper. Then he looked at Poirot, and in his eyes, yet behind the professional composure and the ingenuity and the long years of knowing what to say and when to say it, something went out. Not guilt. Guilt had been there all along, banked and managed and not permitted to interfere with function. What went out was the belief that management was still possible. He sat down in the chair nearest the mantelpiece. He sat down rather heavily, and he did not speak. "I think," Poirot said quietly into the silence of the room, "that there are things that must now be said. Not for my satisfaction, and not for the satisfaction of the law alone, though the law will require its share." He looked at each face in turn, at Fenwick, whose hands rested open on the arms of his chair, at Margaret, who had closed her eyes, at Clara, whose own hands were still on the closed cover of her notebook. For the sake of everyone in this room who has been carrying the weight of other people's silences for a very long time. The fire ticked. Outside, the sea moved steadily against the cliffs, as it had moved the morning they arrived, and as it would move the morning they left, entirely unchanged and entirely unimpressed by the human dramas conducted above it. Caldwell raised his head. "Very well," he said, and he began to speak. Chapter 9. All Masks Removed. He did not begin with a confession. He began, as doctors often do when asked to account for themselves, with a case history. Leonard Caldwell had been 29 years old when he first encountered Arthur Fenwick at a medical conference in Edinburgh, where Caldwell had presented a paper on experimental cardiac therapies. Or Fenwick had attended as a patron of medical research. He funded 3 such endeavours, and had approached Caldwell afterwards with the particular combination of flattery and proposition that men of great money have long since refined to an art. The research was promising, Fenwick said. It required support, and he had, as it happened, a personal interest in cardiac medicine. His daughter, he explained, was not well. "I believed I could help her," Caldwell said. He was addressing no one directly now, his gaze somewhere between the fireplace and the floor, in the manner of a man delivering testimony to his own memory as much as to his audience. That was not a convenient untruth, I told myself afterward. I genuinely believed it. The compound I was working with had produced remarkable results in controlled conditions, and Eleanor's symptoms were consistent with the profile I had studied for 3 years. He paused. I did not know about the cardiac weakness. It was not detected in my preliminary examination. I proceeded. "And she died," Clara said. Her voice was level and held in it neither question nor accusation, but only the weight of a fact that had been circling the room for days, awaiting its proper acknowledgement. "She died," Caldwell said, "within 72 hours of the second administration. I had never seen a reaction of that speed or severity. I understood immediately what had occurred." He stopped. "And I understood immediately what it would mean." Arthur Fenwick, who had not moved throughout this account, said nothing. The angle of his jaw suggested the effort this required. "You went to Fenwick," Poirot said. "He came to me. He arrived at my rooms the morning after Eleanor died, before I had slept, before I had spoken to anyone. He was not as I expected him to be." Caldwell's hands, resting on his knees, turned slightly inward. He was not angry. He was a man in tremendous grief, doing what men of his particular formation always do in tremendous grief. He was managing. He said that a public inquest would destroy the family, compound the tragedy, harm Eleanor's memory. He said the medical establishment would make of it an example that would end my career and suppress the research entirely. A pause. He said we could make it quiet, that all it required was discretion. "And Mallory," Poirot said. "Mallory handled the documentation. He was thorough and he was discreet, and he understood, as such men understand, that his usefulness to Fenwick depended upon his continuing to be both those things. The death certificate was not falsified. Eleanor's heart had failed. But the circumstantial record of her treatment, the dosage notes, the correspondence between myself and Fenwick prior to my engagement, these were removed. The inquest had nothing to work with but absence." Caldwell looked up for the first time since he had begun speaking. and what was in his face was not the thing Poirot had expected. It was not relief, nor defiance, nor even shame in its ordinary form. It was exhaustion of a depth that went well below the personal. I told myself for a long time that it was done, that living well, living usefully, was the only form of reparation available to me. The clinic was that reparation. For 15 years I have run it, and it has done good. Real good. Not the imaginary good of a man constructing his own absolution, but documented, verifiable good. "And Robert Ashcroft?" Clara said. The name entered the room and rearranged everything slightly, the way a single note, properly placed, reharmonizes what came before it. Caldwell turned to look at her. "I did not know about Ashcroft," he said, "until he was already ruined. I did not know that his accusations against Fenwick Industries, a separate matter entirely, you understand, a factory death with which I had no connection, had been traced back to certain documents that Mallory's firm had helped suppress. When I discovered it, I wrote to Fenwick. I told him it had gone too far. He told me I was in no position to draw lines." The briefest alteration in his voice. He was correct. I was not. Clara did not respond. She looked at Caldwell with an expression of concentrated, unforgiving clarity, and then she looked away, which was, in its way, a more complete form of dismissal than anything she might have said. "Mallory," Poirot said, "had carried the original documentation for 10 years. He had kept it, as you supposed, as insurance, but also, I think, because a man who has done what Mallory did requires some form of evidence that he knew the truth, even if he chose not to act upon it. The evidence was his one point of integrity. When he finally decided to use it, he was not, I believe, primarily motivated by legal conscience." He looked around the room. He was dying. His own heart was failing him by ordinary means. A man who knows he has little time sometimes finds that the weight he has been carrying becomes, quite simply, heavier than he can continue to manage. Margaret Fenwick had not spoken since the proceedings began. She spoke now, quietly, without looking up from her hands. "He told me he was sorry," she said, "when we spoke in the garden. Not for what he was about to do, but for what he had not done 10 years ago. He said he had been present at Eleanor's inquest and had watched me give evidence, and had known that I suspected something, and had said nothing." She was silent for a moment. "I told him that sorry was a very small word for a very large absence," he agreed. Fenwick's hands on the arms of his chair had not moved throughout. He was looking at Caldwell with the expression of a man who has arrived at the precise boundary of what he will permit himself to feel in a room full of other people. "You killed him," he said, not loudly, with an almost studied simplicity, as though he had stripped the sentence of every additional element to be certain the remaining ones were accurate. "I killed him," Caldwell said, "because he was about to produce evidence that would close this clinic and imprison me and expose a decade and a half of careful repair as nothing more than a man running from his own history." "Yes." He held Fenwick's gaze. "But I think we must both be honest, Arthur, about the history he was running from." The use of the first name, the first time Caldwell had used it throughout, landed in the room like a stone into standing water, and the ripples of it moved across every face present. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. He turned the medicine bottle on the table once, slowly, with one finger, and then left it. "There is a thing I wish to say," he said at last, in a tone quieter than anything he had used that morning. "Not as a detective and not as a judge, because I am neither in the final instance. I am only a man who has spent a long life watching other men and women choose between the difficult truth and the convenient silence, and who has observed without exception that the silence is always more expensive in the end." He looked at Caldwell. "You wish to protect what the clinic had become. This, I understand. The living were here and they were real, and they were in your care. But the dead, Monsieur Caldwell, the dead do not dissolve into silence simply because we require them to. They wait. They are, in my experience, extraordinarily patient." Caldwell received this without deflection. "I know," he said. Outside, a gust of wind moved along the cliff edge and rattled the sitting-room window in its frame. The same rattle that had threaded through the night since Poirot's arrival, familiar now as a repeated phrase whose meaning had only lately become clear. "What happens now?" Margaret said. Poirot straightened his cuffs with great precision and looked at each of them in turn, at Fenwick and Clara and Margaret, and finally at Caldwell, who sat in his chair beside the cold grate with a particular quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has set something down and discovered, with a surprise that will take time to fully process, that his hands feel lighter for it. "Now," Poirot said, "we call the police." And the sitting-room of St. Anselm's convalescent house, which had maintained its polite silence through a great deal, I maintained it a little longer while outside the sea continued its long, patient work against the cliffs below, and the October light came through the rattling windows, pale and honest and entirely without mercy. Chapter 10. After the storm, the police arrived from Truro in the early afternoon, in the form of an Inspector Merrin and a constable whose name Poirot did not catch and did not need. Merrin was a compact, careful man in his 40s, who had the look of someone accustomed to being the most experienced person in a room, and who received, upon arrival at St. Anselm's, the not entirely welcome sensation of not being that person. He listened to Poirot's account with the attentiveness of a professional who has learned that the attentiveness costs nothing and occasionally saves considerable effort later. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. He then spent an hour with Caldwell and another with the dispensary cabinet, and emerged from both with the expression of a man whose primary emotion is the satisfaction of a case that has been comprehensively arranged for him, tempered by the secondary emotion of mild resentment at owing that arrangement to someone else. Caldwell cooperated throughout with the same exhausted composure he had maintained since his final "very well" in the sitting-room. He answered what was asked. He did not embroider or retract. He signed what was placed before him and stood when he was asked to stand. Watching him, Poirot was reminded of something he had observed many times over many years, that the moment a man stops managing a secret is also the moment he stops managing himself, and the two releases are not always distinguishable from each other. He was taken from St. Anselm's at 3:30. He did not look back at the house as the police motorcar descended the drive. This too, Poirot observed. The afternoon settled into the odd, suspended quality that follows the removal of a central presence from a closed world. The remaining residents occupied the sitting-room at separate intervals, as though by unspoken agreement that the space required some time to reconstitute itself before it could be shared again, without awkwardness. Arthur Fenwick sat alone on the veranda for 2 hours in the cold, which was either contemplation or penance, and which Poirot suspected was, for a man of Fenwick's particular formation, indistinguishable from either. Because at 5 o'clock he came inside and asked to speak with Poirot privately, which Poirot granted. "I want to say," Fenwick began, and then stopped, which was unusual enough in itself to be worth noting. He tried again. "What happened to Eleanor? What I permitted to be done afterward? I have not been easy about it. I wish you to know that." "I believe you," Poirot said simply. "That is more than I expected." "You are not a wicked man, Monsieur Fenwick. You are something that is in some respects more difficult to deal with. A powerful man who has long confused his own comfort with the general good." He paused. "The Ashcroft matter, the foundry, that must also be addressed." Fenwick's jaw set. "I know it. The legal questions are not mine to resolve, but the human ones are yours. Clara Ashcroft is in this house. Her husband cannot be returned to her. Certain other things, however, remain within your capacity to provide." Poirot allowed this to settle. "I will not tell you what they are. You are not without intelligence." Fenwick looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the compressed decisiveness of a man who has made a business decision and intends to execute it, which was perhaps the best that could be expected of him, and which was, all things considered, not nothing. Clara herself came to find Poirot as the light was failing in the corridor outside the dining room, where he was standing with no particular purpose and every appearance of one. "I burned the sketches," she said. "All of them." "The ones of Fenwick's hands?" She considered. "I kept the others. There was one of Mallory that I did not intend to make, and which turned out to be rather good." She looked past Poirot at the panelled wall and the naval officers in their gilt frames, who continued to stare down with the serene inattention of the long dead. "He had a kind face. I had not noticed it while he was alive." Poirot thought of the upturned palms. "He was not, in the end, an entirely ungenerous man," he said. "He was only a frightened one, for a very long time." Clara made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite forgiveness, and which covered, Poirot thought, a considerable amount of territory between the two. "Fenwick spoke to me this evening," she said. "He intends to establish a fund for the families of the foundry men." A pause. "He was very businesslike about it." "Yes," said Poirot. He would be." "I told him it was not enough." "And he said?" "He said he knew." She was quiet for a moment. "I told him I would accept it anyway, not for his sake." She turned and walked back toward the sitting room without further explanation, which was, Poirot reflected, explanation enough. Margaret Fenwick left St. Anselm's the following morning. She came downstairs at 8 o'clock with 2 cases and the expression of a woman who has slept better than she has slept in some years, and is not yet certain how to account for that fact. She and Poirot passed in the entrance hall, and she stopped. "I shan't go back," she said, "to Arthur, in case you wondered." "I had not wondered," Poirot said, which was true. "I had assumed." Something that was very nearly a smile crossed her face. "I was a governess once. I dare say I can be something again." "I dare say you can be a considerable number of things," Poirot said warmly, "given that you are now free to select among them without restriction." She looked at him with an expression in which gratitude and composure and a quiet, newly uncovered independents were arranged in the particular proportion that belongs to women who have managed more than they should have been asked to manage, and have emerged from it with their faculties intact and their illusions appropriately diminished. She shook his hand and went out to the waiting motor. Poirot spent the remaining morning packing his own cases with the thoroughness that the process always demanded of him. George, his valet, was not present to perform this service, and the lack of George was felt, as it always was, in the field, in the small but cumulative ways that competence, when absent, makes itself known. The smaller case was packed to his satisfaction on the first attempt. The larger required 3. Nurse Green he did not seek out because there was nothing further to be gained from it. She had known what was in Fenwick's tea because she had placed it there herself. Not from a desire to harm Fenwick, Poirot was now certain, but as a warning to Caldwell that his management of the situation had ceased to be manageable. Her brother's death at another clinic, years earlier, under circumstances uncomfortably similar to Eleanor Fenwick's, had brought her to St. Anselm's with purposes of her own. Whether those purposes had been served was a question that Merrin's investigation would, in time, address. Poirot had provided the inspector with a sealed note on the subject and considered his professional obligation discharged. He carried his cases to the entrance hall at 10:30 and stood for a moment beneath the naval officers, who had seen everything and said nothing, and would continue to do so indefinitely, which made them, Poirot reflected, more discreet than anyone else who had occupied this house in recent memory. Outside, the morning fog lay over the cliff tops in long, pale drifts, and the sea below was invisible in it, present only as a sound. That long, low exhalation that had accompanied every night of his stay, breathing in the dark beneath the house as steadily and indifferently as it had breathed for centuries before St. Anselm's existed, and would breathe for centuries after it had ceased to. Poirot adjusted his tie at the small mirror beside the front door. He aligned it with the precision it deserved. He smoothed his moustache with 2 fingers, assessed the result, and found it satisfactory. Then he paused. Just a moment. Not from sentimentality. He was not, as a rule, a sentimental man. But a case, when it is finished, leaves behind it a particular quality of air, the way a concert hall retains something of the music after the last note has gone. And it seemed to him that this pause was owed to the dead, if not to the living. To Eleanor, who had played the piano and been fond of larks. To Robert Ashcroft, who had known a true thing and found the world unwilling to hear it. And to Edward Mallory, who had carried a truth for 10 years in the wrong pocket and had, in the end, chosen the only form of courage available to a dying man. The motor car waited on the drive. The fog breathed. Poirot picked up his cases and went out into it. Behind him, the door of St. Anselm's convalescent house closed with the soft, unhurried sound of a place that had finished with one chapter of itself and was not yet certain what would come next. The sea breathed on, honest now in its great indifferent way, and the silence that settled over the house was not the silence that had been there at the beginning. Not the silence that conceals and presses and suffocates. It was the silence that follows the telling of the truth, which is a different thing entirely. Quieter, yes, but far less dangerous.